Welcome back to AP U.S. History. We're going to talk about the War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of Independence. Why so? Because we're going to fight the British all over again. Um, Here shows the election of 1808. Madison is going to be elected President of the United States. Pinckney, remember he negotiated the treaty with Spain, is going to run against him. An independent named Clinton, but Madison is going to prevail. So he's going to become President of the United States, the fourth president. He, like Jefferson and Adams and Washington, wanted to avoid war. He didn't feel that we were strong enough to go toe-to-toe with the British or the French. He strongly supported Jefferson's views, avoid war at all costs. The Macron Bill number 2 is adopted by Congress, which replaced the Non-Intercourse Act or the Non-Importation Act of 1909. Again, it expanded trade but exempted or kept Americans from trading with England and France. This replaced the Non-Intercourse or Non-Importation Act of 1809, replaced the Embargo Act. And so this Macron 2 is just an extension of not trading with the British or the French. Again, factories closed in America, but we are forced to become more self-sufficient because we can't get goods from England. And it will lay the foundation for the United States becoming an industrial power. Jefferson was a critic of the industrial America. Ironically, he contributed to it by his policy of the Embargo Act. But it was pretty much to force the British and French to respect us, which they didn't, because they were locked in a war for survival, and they didn't want us trading. Either side didn't want the other to receive goods from America. Napoleon always hoped secretly that the U.S. would go to war with Great Britain. Madison accepts Napoleon's commitment, and he says, we want to be friends with you, and we'll stop seizing your ships. So he draws restrictions on the French. The British demand that the U.S. withdraw the restrictions off her, but until France had withdrawn all restrictions on American shipping. So it goes back and forth. The Napoleonic Wars continue, and we talked about the Berlin Decrees, the Order of Council, Milan. All of these things are a little background information leading up to the War of 1812. America was just in a no-win situation. But Napoleon did say that he was going to treat the Americans better, hoping that this would spur the Americans to be more resentful towards Great Britain. War hawks were those folks in Congress who wanted a war. Some of them were seeking the glory that their fathers had earned during the Revolutionary War. Henry Clay was probably the strongest proponent of war with Great Britain. John C. Calhoun, another war hawk, demanding that we go to war against Great Britain because they weren't respecting us as a bona fide nation. In the meantime, the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 worsened relationships with Great Britain. Two Shawnee twin brothers, Tecumseh and the Prophet, organized a confederacy, received aid from the British, and they were hoping to get rid of the whites in the Ohio area and the Northwest Territory. The Americans thought the British were aiding him, and they were. General William H. Harrison will be assigned to repel the Indians at the attack of Tippecanoe. It shows a picture of Tecumseh. He was trying to regain Indian land, but eventually will fail. British General Brock meets with Tecumseh to try to instigate trouble with the Americans. And this worsens the relationship between the Americans and the British. The battle ended. The Indian threat, this battle of Tippecanoe in the Northwest Territory. And it just pushed them further west. More settlers are moved west. There were warhawks who called for an invasion of Canada to remove all Indian threats and to teach the British a lesson. The British, they figured, were occupied with Napoleon, and Canada was theirs for the taking. Some Federalists, like Daniel Webster, spoke against the action, saying it was foolhardy. He wanted to protect New England interests, particularly their manufacturing industry, and so he wanted to open up trade with Great Britain. Some of the causes for the war: America declared war in 1812 for a variety of reasons. One, because the British continued to take our ships and impress our sailors. We tended to be a little partial, the Democratic Republicans, towards the French because of their help during the Revolutionary War. Indian problems on the frontier worsened relationships between the United States and Great Britain. Of course, the Chesapeake Leopard affair we talked about earlier incited Americans because the Leopard had fired on the Chesapeake, killing American sailors. And there were some Americans who wanted to acquire Canada. They thought that would be a good thing to expand our borders. New England states are most opposed, as well as some of the Mid-Atlantic states like Pennsylvania. New Englanders believed that the British actions were exaggerated, and they still disliked the French. They were also opposed to acquisition of Canada, and they believed that war would hurt business in the New England area. And during the War of 1812, they refused to let their militia serve outside the states. This is an overview of the war. The Polka Dot area shows the naval blockade that the British have on the Americans and some of the actions. Some of the major actions will take place in Baltimore, D.C., and New Orleans. There were some actions conducted in Canada and on the Great Lakes. Overview of the war: Americans have a very small navy that really can't match up with the British. The land battles are poorly fought for the most part by the Americans. The militia are unprepared, untrained for war. The attack they do launch on Canada is a complete failure. Washington, D.C. will be burned to the ground, but the British will be turned back at Baltimore. The Federalists undermined the war effort. As far as American victories, the U.S. Navy defeated the Royal Navy on the Great Lakes, but this isn't really all that significant. But it does pave the way for our dominance into the West. So we were unprepared. We had 12 ships versus 800. Seems like a mismatch. Americans just like to draft, preferred to enlist. Disorganized state militia, financially unprepared. Revenue from tariffs dropped significantly as a result of the war. And there were some regional difficulties or disagreements on how it should be conducted. This shows the British marching on Washington and burning the White House. Francis Scott Key, Star Spangled Banner, will turn the British back at Fort McHenry. This shows The raid on Fort Oswego was a success for the British. Uh, the raid on American forts and villages in 1814 during the War of 1812. So this is on Lake Oswego, Ontario. The real victory that will come out of the war will be in New Orleans, but this is after a peace treaty has been signed with Great Britain. But we do stop them in New Orleans. The war ends in a stalemate. America gained some diplomatic and military respect, dubbed the Second War of Independence. With this war, the Federalists will be seen as unpatriotic during the war because they don't fully support the American effort. Large Native American losses during the war. American industry was stimulated as a result of it. This shows Jackson's campaign in New Orleans, and he'll turn back to the British, and they'll suffer thousands of casualties, thousands of British soldiers killed, only a few Americans killed, but the war is over. But Jackson will become a national hero that will vault him into the presidency. The Hartford Convention was held during the War of 1812, and again calling for succession, getting out of the Union. The Hartford Convention, attended by Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire. These were New England states. They were to discuss the complaints and seek compensation for losses during the war. It's really about economics. Their immediate goal was to secure financial assistance from the national government due to the British blockading New England forts or ports. A minority of the radical delegates urged succession, but that was never carried out. They also offered an amendment to the Constitution, which said that 3/5 compromise to reduce Southern influence in the House of Representatives, that should be ended, which was agreed in the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Required 2/3 vote for an embargo by all states, and admission of Western states to the Union, and declaration of war. So they want to get some power. They believe that the president should be limited to one term, deny naturalized citizens the right to hold government offices. 3 delegates traveled to Washington to make their demands, but some other things transpired. The Battle of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent made their pleas moot or non-existent. As a result of the resolution, it's really a death sentence on the Federalist Party. 1816, Jeffersonian candidate John Monroe will crush the Federalist opponent. Of course, the exaggerations of treason were overblown. Again, the talk of nullification surfaces again. As far as what we got from the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, it was just really an armistice, a ceasefire. And we signed the Treaty of Ghent, and the war is over. Both sides agreed to stop fighting. No mention of pre-war grievances, impressment, Indian problems, order of council, all the things that took them to war really isn't discussed. Americans retain the right to fish off the Canadian coast. The problems will disappear when Napoleon is defeated in Europe at the Battle of Waterloo. This is the last major conflict between the Americans and the Great Britain. And we'll